Flats Cold War Museum Oral History Project. I'm interviewing Art Geis. I'm Hannah Nordhaus, and we're at Art's house in Arvada, and it is the 21st of March, 2005. So to start with, Art, if you could just tell me a little bit about your background, where you grew up, what your parents did.
I was born in Houston, Texas. My dad was a banker in Houston. They originally grew up in Kansas, moved down to Houston. I was born after the war, 1947. And spent most of my growing up time in Texas, either in Fort Worth as a elementary school age child or in Beaumont, Texas, where I went to high school, where I met my wife, future wife at the time. And then got interested in metallurgical engineering in high school and ended up going to the Colorado School of Mines in Boulder, Colorado. And from there, ended up in the Army for a while and jobs in the petroleum industry first, and then with Samsonite Corporation when I moved to Denver after getting a master's in business, and then finally at Rocky Flats in 1983.
And when was the first time you heard of Rocky Flats?
Actually, when I was in college at Colorado School of Mines, we had classmates who were interns, summer interns there. So we knew of the plant at that point in time. In fact, I was in school the year of the 1969 fire.
So did you hear about it then?
Yeah, that was my senior year.
So the interns must have had some exciting stories.
Yeah, they did. It's fairly interesting. They couldn't talk about much, but pretty interesting.
That. So when you came to work at Rocky Flats, how did that come about?
Well, it was kind of interesting. I actually came back to Colorado as a Samsonite employee, working on die casting among other things. And then I had moved on to an engineering firm, a small engineering firm. It didn't work out, and so I was unemployed for a few months. And a friend of mine who I'd worked with at Samsonite had gone to work at Rocky Flats. So I called him and he got me an interview. And because of my die casting experience, they hired me to work in plutonium metallurgy because they were working on plutonium die casting. So I started in May of '83, and that was my first project to work on plutonium die casting.
And die casting is?
It's putting molten metal under pressure and transferring it into a die form under pressure to fill the die, as opposed to gravity casting where you just pour it into a mold shape.
What's it, when you say die form, that's?
The die form is the shape of the form that you're going to make. And so there's two halves, a male and a female, and the metal, molten metal goes in between the two halves, solidifies and makes the form.
Oh, okay.
So they were working on die casting of plutonium, and that's what I started working on.
So were you working actually on the production line, or were you?
We had a developmental lab, a small-scale machine that we worked on, and then we had a full-scale machine that we were building a prototype, which was in the production facility at the time. So we finished that project at a production full-scale. I worked on the project from '83 to, I guess, about '87, when we finished the full-scale testing. But it was just a prototype. Wasn't a production scale project.
And what was it going to do?
The idea was to make plutonium hemoshells in the die cast process because it had metallurgical properties that some of the designers were looking for. That was the idea.
Hemoshells are like half of a sphere,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and these would be the pits.
Yes, correct.
And so when you first came there, was it like anywhere else you had worked before?
Well, I'd worked in manufacturing, metallurgical manufacturing places a lot where we had different kinds of casting, but lots of the same machining and heat treating furnaces, but different in the standpoint that the material we were working with was completely different. So the glove box environment was all new to me. Mm-hmm. But the processes were basic metallurgical processes that I was familiar with.
Was it more theoretical or more experimentation than you?
A lot more scientists around and a lot more scientific work, but mostly engineering work, really. The plant was still an engineering applications place, mm-hmm. where we put the scientists thinking into work.
And what about the security? That must have been different.
Well, it was. back in those days, you didn't initially start cleared necessarily if you were an engineer like me. So I had to sit in an uncleared area for a few months before I got my clearance, before I could actually go to work on, so I did odd jobs for them. But, you know, I had been in the military after college, so I was used to having security clearance from the military perspective. So it wasn't all that different.
What was the process of getting the security clearance very similar to when you were in the military?
Actually, it was more detailed. The background investigation was more detailed and thorough than what it was for the military.
What sort of, they asked your relatives about you?
Yeah, I had to do a detailed 25-year history, places I'd lived, associations, you know, all the people you knew, had to walk through your work history, summer jobs, everything, so that they could go and check up on everything.
And what did you do in the military?
I was a platoon leader in a combat engineer battalion, stateside, and then Vietnam after that.
So after this project ended in 1987, where did you go from there?
I became the manager of the Plutonium metallurgy group. The die casting project we did not go forward with at production scale. That was a decision made. Wasn't economically viable for what we were getting out of it. And I became the manager of the group, so we worked on just continuing process development and support of production processes at the time.
Was it disappointing not to have the project you worked on for 4 years?
A little bit, because we'd gotten it to where it was a good product. But we had to kind of agree that the next step was going to be pretty expensive. Scaling up to production was a pretty expensive proposition, and there were just as good a ways to make the product as that were already in use. So we weren't really going to gain much.
Okay, so it was trying to sort of improve on an existing process, and it was just more expensive because you'd have to create a whole new production.
Right, new equipment would have had to been developed, more of it. You know, our single prototype machine was highly specialized. We had a lot of engineering support. To make it a production system would have been a lot more of expense. And nobody in the weapons design business really could show anybody that what they hoped to gain from it they really needed from a performance perspective. So it wasn't really warranted at the time. Interestingly enough, though, that process is now expected to be the base process for any modern facility. Die casting will be the process of choice to start with.
Huh. Because they'll be starting from scratch.
Right. And some of the design labs have taken the process farther along, and so it's gotten better. So that's kind of neat.
Is it being put in now? Are they?
Well, the government's funding a modern facility at least up to the point of a decision process, put it that way. So there's a fundamental design process going on, and die casting is the base foundry process that they're putting in the base design.
Is that what they're doing at Los Alamos? Is that
well, actually Lawrence Livermore has the contract to do the development of that particular component of the production facility. Los Alamos basically took over the responsibility to have a production capability after we closed. So they're not really die casting down there, they're just gravity casting.
So I assume that it's on a smaller scale, what they're talking about, than what was at Rocky Flats?
In terms of production, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, much fewer units, much fewer.
And everything will be new and
Yeah.
modern and improved. And
Yeah.
That'll be interesting.
The balance between complex and simple.
Right. Now, someone who was this, one guy I interviewed was saying that because there's no testing, that you do have to use a lot of the processes that were worked out in the early Rocky Flats days, because you can't do trial and error, I guess.
Yeah, that's a valid concern. The physicists always worry about any change in the base product and how it's going to affect the performance of the weapon in use. And so they're pretty conservative in that regard. And so tested components are much more preferable to them than untested. Although you could make an argument that mathematically you could figure out it won't make a difference.
Right.
But they're pretty conservative.
Does that mean using like 1950s equipment then?
No, it's not the equipment. It's how the design ends up in terms of its structure and its shape and complexity is in terms of whether or not they'll have confidence it'll perform the way they intend.
So you could use a different machine as long as it created the exact same measurements?
Yeah.
Got it. Huh. Okay, well, I'm going off subject, but
Yeah.
so you took over the plutonium
Metallurgy group. And so we provided day-to-day support for production of the plutonium components. We were responsible to make sure that the processes that we were currently using continued to perform with reliability, and so the scrap rates were down and the rework was down, and when we had problems we had to go evaluate if the equipment had failed or if we had a material issue of some other kind. And we were always working on trying to improve what we had in terms of process performance to reduce the scrap rate, reduce the rework rate. I mean, standard manufacturing technology to try to get a higher efficiency product stream, lower the cost.
without major
Right,
investments?
without major investment. We'd already developed a lot of new equipment over the course of the time. I mean, die casting was just one project of many. And so our group had lots of responsibilities for all the processes.
So how long were you in that group?
Oh, until probably in '80, I bounced around a little bit within R&D. I went to work in the machining engaging group for about a 1-year period, working on some new machining equipment for non-plutonium machining applications. I ended up taking over the coatings group for a little while. So the last half of the '80s, I had various responsibilities between plutonium and non-plutonium manufacturing process support until the FBI raid in '89, when everybody's life changed.
Yes. So how does your life change?
Well, I was plucked out of my simple process management group into work on a team to do what we called resumption. My team was established to basically go through and look at the facility infrastructure and resume the facilities one at a time. And that evolved into being responsible for managing one of the facilities for restart. In fact, 2 of them. So completely changed my life.
And so managing for restart meant trying to get them to the point where it's acceptable.
Exactly. All the new requirements and standards that Admiral Watkins, as the new Secretary of Energy, was imposing upon the restart of Rocky Flats and other facilities. I actually became the facility manager of Building 559, which was the first facility to restart under that regime. I also had a laboratory facility, 779 building. They were both labs, and so I got responsibility for both of them. And we concentrated on 559, thinking it would be easier because it was smaller. And it still took us a long time to get it restarted. So,
What did 559?
in February, what did it do? It was an chemical analytical laboratory. So it analyzed radioactive materials for contaminants and also for content to make sure that they met the specifications for the product stream, basically, and also did contaminated environmental analysis for any waste or any environmental samples. It was the radioactive lab at the site.
So what did you have to do to get it restarted?
We had to write all new procedures to operate the facility by, to meet new standards. We developed a new, what they call authorization basis or safety basis for the facility that met new requirements, implemented new controls. We had to establish whether or not the equipment that like the ventilation systems met the requirements. So we had to test every system to prove that they would meet the requirements. And of course, those systems were over the years had not, the design was no longer written down on paper very accurately, so we had to go back and sort of walk hand over hand and do walk downs and test the systems at the component level to see if they worked. We had to have all of our procedures rewritten and people trained, and We had to go through a formal qualification process for most of those people to meet all the DOE order requirements for running a nuclear facility. So it was a pretty laborious process.
Were all the ventilation systems able to?
Eventually,
they could...
eventually we were able to refurbish them and bring them up to standard where they meet the requirements of the safety bases. There were a lot of issues, a lot of modifications that had been made that weren't well documented, people that had since retired, and poor records kept, so we had a lot of discovery to do.
What kind of modifications?
Usually control system modifications where they had had a problem with the system, and when they went out to diagnose it, they sort of diagnosed it at the simple level, and they made what I would call a patch, and they got it back working, and that was good enough, and went off about their business. And the guy who did the modification might have had notes in a little book he kept, and as long as he came back to work on it, he knew how the system worked. But if anybody else worked on it, they were coming in kind of blind. So it was interesting to do all that testing. It was lots of long nights.
Well, what was the most surprising thing you found?
That they had modified the overall ventilation system control circuitry so that in fact, it performed in some cases, but not in others. And they didn't really know that they had made such a change that would defeat some of the features of it that were nice to have. They just never realized that the modifications they did had changed it, and so we had quite a few surprises on that system. You'd do a test and it would shut completely down, and you had to go find out why. That's where most of the changes were that were hard to trace down.
Huh. So how long did it take you to get back up and running?
Well, let's see. We actually restarted that building in February of 2002.
Wow.
Yeah.
You were restarting, so that took
2 years.
2002.
I'm sorry.
92.
92. I'm sorry. February of 92.
13 years.
Lost a whole decade. February of 1992.
Okay.
About the same month the Berlin Wall came down, as I recall.
And then when was the change of mission?
Very shortly thereafter, because President Bush declared the Cold War over and the wall came down, and not too much long after that did our mission change. I don't remember the exact, because we restarted Building 707 sometime that same year. But the new contract wasn't issued until 1995, and so there was a period of time between 92 and 94 where we still had a mission some point along there, and I've frankly lost when they declared we weren't going to restart. It may have been as late as 94 for all I remember.
So all that work to get it up and running, and then?
Oh, it paid off in the long run. It really did.
How so?
Well, all the things we did primarily with the people in the facility, that facility operated to a really high standard when we restarted. And that facility never wavered from that standard from the day it restarted till the day we tore it down. I mean, just a good, solid base of operations, and really set the standard for how the plant site decided to operate after that. Because the requirements weren't relaxed. Mm-hmm. They were still nuclear facilities and still had to maintain that level of performance to maintain their safety. So it was a good thing we did it from the standpoint of what the regulatory expectations became.
And then what was the other building that you were refurbishing?
779 I was responsible for. It was a research facility that had smaller scale processes of almost every type that we worked with in various materials, not only plutonium but also uranium and stainless steel processes as well. So it was a pretty complete research laboratory.
And how did the refurbishing go on that one?
Well, it was a lower priority building to refurbish, so we actually never went through the restart process on that facility. We only started up a very small portion of it to deal with some existing hazards that we wanted to stabilize. And so it was a real small scale little effort. But that still took about 6 to 9 months. And we managed the stabilization in about 6 hours. And then the facility was able to continue its research and development mission till we basically changed the mission of the plant site.
And what were the hazards you were trying to save?
When you store materials like plutonium over a period of time, they degrade, and sometimes they can become reactive in certain configurations. And so you don't want to have a reactive climate there left untreated. We wanted to treat some of the components we had in that facility because they were approaching a reactive nature. So we recommended to management that we deal with them, and it was a pretty small scale activity. And they agreed and let us go through the process of preparing to do that one activity, which we did quite safely.
Okay, so that takes you to the change of mission, and then where did you go from there?
Well, I ran all the labs on the entire site after that for the last portion of that EG&G contract. And we were starting to do business development and improving business systems for the laboratories because there was a lot more environmental lab work. So we were starting to outsource our laboratory work and trying to manage costs versus commercial laboratories. And then when the Kaiser-Hill closure contract came in place, I moved into an area of trying to reinvent the safety basis or authorization basis process I mentioned that had been such a high standard for us to reach to restart the facility. Whole new career for me, whole different process of trying to license or authorize buildings to function under the new standards. But as a closure site, not wanting to authorize them to operate, but rather authorize the hazard removal portion. So a completely different approach to what you're trying to accomplish. And under the Kaiser-Hill contract, it was one of the major strategies to establish the closure project on a good footing. Like developing the Rocky Flats cleanup agreement strategy on the environmental side, with the agreement of the regulators like the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment and the EPA. Well, this authorization basis strategy for nuclear facility closure was a really important part of that strategy, so we were on an even footing with the DOE and the Defense Nuclear Facility Safety Board about, okay, now we're going to tear this place down. Let's be smart about how we authorize the work. So it was a key activity in that. And we kind of stepped out on a limb and tried to essentially reinvent how the Department of Energy licensed that kind of work, because they had never really tackled it. The environmental management portion of DOE had never established how they would do that because they'd never really tried to close a major facility. We were the first. So we kind of took a leap of faith and went out on a limb with them and with the Defense Board to try to come up with a better process, and began to work on that in the middle 90s, 95. And I was the project leader for that project.
So that was sort of creating processes in the same way that you created processes to resume with the new standards.
Correct,
It was
exactly.
creating processes to take the buildings apart and continue to meet those standards.
Exactly, right. Try to grade the standards to the mission. We're removing hazards now, not building weapons. And since, like I said, the Department of Energy hadn't really ever done this and hadn't really addressed it, we felt like it was a key attribute of trying to close the site on a schedule. And so that was an innovative approach. It was a tough project.
How did you feel about creating these processes to destroy something rather than to build something?
Yeah.
Did it feel different?
Yes, because I'm a manufacturing guy by nature. I mean, I worked before Rocky Flats, always in manufacturing at different places. And so manufacturing processes were what were fun to me, building things. So it was a whole new job to take on. I guess I realized we weren't going to continue to build. I mean, that was made pretty clear. So I sort of took the idea that, well, I live here and I've worked here, and so I know something. So what better group of people to take it down? So let's, wherever I can help, that's what I'm going to do.
do you feel less pride in that?
No, actually I don't. When we finish and we can walk out there in that green field and it'll be an open space for wildlife, that's going to be pretty cool.
So do you want to stay in that field now, or go back to manufacturing when you?
Oh, I've been too far out of manufacturing, I'm afraid. That's an industry that moves pretty quick. I suspect I wouldn't be knowledgeable in what goes on in manufacturing anymore. So it's going to be kind of hard to step back out of the cleanup mode. I mean, when you've learned the hard lessons, and that's the continuing mission of closing high hazard sites around the world now, that's probably the best place for me to try to get work, I suspect.
There's probably plenty of it.
I expect so. If you're willing to travel or live in lousy places, it's probably quite a bit of work.
Well, I guess you'll try to travel then, right?
I expect so. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I guess going backwards a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that we're trying to document in this oral history project is the buildings, since they're not going to be there, and we actually
Right.
have a grant to the part of the discuss. Part of the thing that this grant is funding is discussion of the buildings. So it sounds like you're quite familiar with them.
Yeah.
And I guess maybe you could just tell me. And you worked, I guess, in the D&D process. You must have been in even more of them than you worked in your career during production.
Well, interestingly enough, in plutonium metallurgy and then subsequently in the labs and then in facility management, which is really what I was for resumption, I ended up sort of operating a lot of facilities at the site at one time or another. And I've not really been involved directly in the decommissioning of tearing one of them down. I was in the planning for tearing them down,
Mm-hmm.
but I've moved on to different roles since then. So, I worked in a lot of the plutonium production buildings and the non-plutonium production buildings throughout my time, either as a facility operator or as a production process support person.
Mm-hmm.
So, lots of different ones.
Are there any buildings that were particularly memorable to you, or?
Well, it was interesting. One of your questions that you had us think about was what was the different sort of personality. Building 771, which is where plutonium metallurgy was housed as a group. So we had a major laboratory, several laboratories in the backside of that building. It was a fascinating building to be in because they were very close-knit as a whole building group. And it was sort of we against the world kind of attitude. It was a very tight-knit group. It always has been, I think, from what I can tell from talking to folks who were in it from the beginning. And even to the day when it was being torn down, they were very much a close-knit family in that building. You weren't an outsider in a mean way, but you literally were an outsider if you weren't a Building 771er. So it was kind of a neat place to be because that was basically the original plutonium facility from a processing standpoint at the site, where a lot of history had gone on. And so you learned a lot from the old timers being there, even if the processes weren't still going on, for example. You picked up a lot of good information, process knowledge-wise, about things they'd tried in the past that didn't work, and so you didn't revisit old ground and the like. So it was a fascinating building to work in. I thoroughly enjoyed the people there. And Building 707, the production building, modern, more production-oriented, different, much more driven to produce high-quality product on a schedule because it was a piece part as opposed to a chemistry building. And different, but again, extremely close-knit with a single-minded mission about making schedule with high-quality product, because if it didn't meet the quality requirements, it didn't get shipped. And so it was more like the buildings I'd worked in other manufacturing plants, where you're really producing the end product. So it was a lot of fun to work in as well. And the laboratories were directly coupled to those bigger buildings because they provided the support and the analysis. And so, but there was always a difference There was literally like two different families, if you will, on either side of the street.
Now, well, two questions. My first question is, was it close-knit because they were sort of working with hot materials and there was this fraternity of people who...
Yeah. Certainly you had to rely on, you had to trust your peers. You had to take care of each other. You had to know what you were doing. And so when you came in new, they trained you pretty heavily, usually one-on-one with an experienced person. And once you showed that you could measure up, then you were part of the group. And so they took care of each other. And it really did become like a fraternity or sorority, or in this case, we had lots of gals and guys working together, all talented people. And they knew, for the most part, that they did what no other place did. A lot of pride in that. So it was close-knit in that regard, I would say. You really formed a family because you couldn't tell people what you did. People outside had a very different image of what you did than what really went on. So I think in that regard, that produced the closeness. Not to say that people in buildings excluded other people, because Rocky Flats as a whole was a pretty strong fraternity. In fact, a lot of families, multiple generations of families, aunts and uncles, brothers and sisters, nephews, lots of families worked out there. So they're really pretty close-knit community all told. Mm-hmm. Fairly interesting place to work in that regard. Nobody was a stranger at the site. You knew a lot of people's names, even though it was a big place.
So the second part of that question, you had said that the lab, there was a difference between the labs and the manufacturing facilities. Was that a like sort of union, non-union thing? Was that what it was? Or? No,
the labs are support to the big production guys. The big production guys are producing the product, or the big chemistry guys are producing the material to make the product. And the labs were there for support. And so they got told what to do, when to do it, when the production building needed it. And so there was a lot of, there was a little bit of tension, not a lot of tension. And if the labs had trouble, there wasn't much forgiving because we had a schedule to meet. So sometimes it was interesting going to work then with the laboratory guys to see the difference in perspective, because they cared just as much and worked just as hard, but they had a completely different job to do. And if you think about it, in a manufacturing environment with materials, the lab is really a quality control function, because if you are making the product out of bad material, it's not going to perform. So it's extremely critical to know what the chemistry of the product was, and we had very tight specifications as a result. And having worked in plutonium metallurgy, where we owned the spec for the plutonium, we set the specifications down technically, and then going to work in the labs where they did the results and the analysis on the coupons or the samples that we made, was kind of neat to see how that fit together. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
So back to the personality of the buildings, in terms of sort of the physical personalities of the buildings, as opposed to the work culture, I assume some were older and some were very sort of Cold War, early Cold War, 50s buildings, and some were very modern. Mm-hmm. Were there ones that stood out in that respect?
Well, of course, in the numbering scheme at the plant site, all the buildings that ended in 1 were the first of their areas. 991, which was, I think, the first building at the site, was the first building in the 900 area. 771, the first building in the 700 area. So those were older, from the beginning buildings. 881, 111, the administration building, 441. And they had a certain character about them. I mean, you've heard all the history about, or the press about the most dangerous building in America and all that. But certainly the older buildings, because of the nature of how they evolved, were pretty unique because they'd been modified over the years, significant changes in what was done in them and parts of them. And so there were places you went into and you kind of wondered, what they used to do in here. It's been reorganized, remodified, complex layouts, you know, you didn't want to get lost in them, that sort of thing. And then some of the other buildings that were, I guess, the next generation were still fairly old and complex. You didn't really get to a modern facility until you went to the non-nuclear manufacturing side. Building 460 was the most modern facility. It was built while I was there. Completely unique in that respect, because it was really the only young production facility on the site. Everything else was really pretty old by today's standards in terms of history, and also a complex history. Lots of changes in what they did over the years. So you had to rely on people who'd been there to really know how things worked and how they went together and that sort of thing. So that was kind of a unique part of it. You had to be open to learn from who'd been there, or else you're going to get yourself in trouble. Which is not uncommon at every manufacturing plant I've ever worked at, by the way. They all have, you come in new, you better come in listening.
Right.
Because otherwise you're asking for trouble.
And I guess as management, you better make sure you keep people around.
Exactly, yeah. The talent base is just irreplaceable in that kind of situation.
Do they do a good job of that at Rocky Flats?
I think we have over the years, yeah. I mean, obviously now it's getting tougher and tougher, but I think over the years we did a really good job of maintaining talent base. We worried about it a lot, losing it, but so as a result we paid attention to it, I think.
And it sounds like in the resumption process, though, there were times where that brain you needed was not there anymore.
That was a strained time too, because it was a different mission. A lot of people, I mean, it was hard. You know, the attitude from the outside was that we, you know, weren't where they wanted us, and yet what we'd been doing all along had received pretty high marks. So that was a pretty difficult emotional time for the whole site. Mm-hmm. I think one of the unique features of Rocky Flats as a community is that it adapted, the people collectively adapted to that change and took on the mission to close it, and are going to close it ahead of schedule. And I believe that that may be never repeated, actually.
Really?
I believe that, frankly. That the chemistry as a result of this community and how it adapted to the change may never be repeated in the DOE system.
What is particularly unique about this community?
Manufacturing production personnel, for the most part, scientists, engineers, people who are used to producing product, either chemical or metallurgical, to a schedule, to high quality, and then having this oversight come in and basically shut you down and say you have to bring your standards up to this level before we let you restart. You work for years to get there, and then you have no mission. And then you're told, well, we're going to close the place and we need your help to do it. Something about this workforce took all that on. You know, I can't put my finger on, but I just have a sneaking suspicion the other sites are not as metropolitan. They're more remote. They're more company towns, if you could, you know, the DOE system, huge employer in this area at least, although this was a large place, wasn't the only employment game in town. And I just get the sense from having traveled to those other sites that they're much more, there's a bigger wall around them in terms of how they look at the outside world. That, you know, it's just a sense. Having said that, that's the challenge for the DOE, because the people that work there are no different than the people that work here in terms of their knowledge and ability and skills and ability to adapt to change. But it's a different climate. Places like Idaho, where you're in a remote facility, it's an hour from the town to get to the site. That's a difference. You know, it will just be different.
Yeah.
I'm convinced of that.
And I guess I imagine there's so many universities here too that might.
You know, I don't know. I just have a sneaking suspicion that the change this site went through, none of the other sites really went through the same change. Mm-hmm. And it may take that kind of change for the closure projects to be successful.
And you mean the change in terms of change of mission or change of...
We went from production to this massive oversight transition phase where we were doing nothing except preparing to restart, end of mission, closure. That transition, which took a decade, that I lost in the first part of the interview, no other site's gone through that transition. So they may find it difficult to go to closure not having gone through that transition. That's my opinion.
So you're saying the long time period to prepare, prepare mentally, or
to deal with the body shocks and the emotional shocks and all that of all the changes. It's probably, I mean, I think our workforce got tempered, or to use a metallurgical, got tempered by all that, and just said they became resilient, very resilient. That's a term you'll hear out of a lot of people who went through it. Is the resilient ones survived and the ones who weren't didn't.
So, what's it like out there now as people are leaving?
It's hard. That's the hardest part.
Yeah.
This is a big month for layoffs. Big month. Next month will be another big one. That's tough. Going away parties is hard.
Yeah. You must have been going to a lot of them.
Yeah. Saying goodbye to a lot of people. Nobody will be around to take me to lunch, see when they'll all be gone.
Did we get through so we got through where you were planning for decommissioning, and then, so what are you doing?
I now manage safety programs at the central level for the site, the nuclear safety program, the criticality safety program, the conduct of operations program, fire protection engineering program, and quality assurance. At the site level, I'm responsible for those programs.
Well, what kind of nuclear and criticality safety do you have now, if there's...
Well, we are, in fact, going to end the criticality safety program next month. The rules in the Department of Energy of when a program applies are at a lot lower level of hazard than you would think intuitively. But by the end of the month, we will have no need for a criticality safety program, and we have that in place to cancel it. I hope by the end of June we'll have no reason for a nuclear safety program, and we'll cancel that.
So what's left now is just sort of what's in the buildings that are...
Well, industrial safety, because it's a deconstruction site, a lot of big equipment.
Right.
It's pretty hazardous construction work. Radiological safety is still important because we still have radioactive materials, contaminants, if you will, in the waste streams and in the ground, and that we're cleaning up, and so you still have to worry about radiological hazards. So those are the two primary safety programs that will remain. The beryllium program's still in place, of course, until they're removing major facilities that were beryllium processing facilities as we speak. So that program remains in place. And of course the long-term health effects program from all those will be part of what DOE continues. So that's kind of the nature of the beast at this point.
So, still busy.
Yeah.
Well, so I guess just to ask, I have this question about a typical day of work at Rocky Flats for you. It sounds like there was no typical day necessarily.
Well, but I saw in your notes there's a couple of things, getting through the security. I guess it was the late 80s, about the same time we were getting all these other changes as the security changes came in, where we had to add a lot of security features to the plant site, a lot more sophistication to how you got in terms of access control. So it took longer to get through the security processes in the mornings. But, it's just, you adapt, you learn how to deal with it. Go to work inside the security zone, and then it seemed like every night when you were about to leave, there'd be a security alarm, they'd have a lockdown, and you'd have to sit there. I always used to think there was a bell in my desk that when I got up to leave, they'd have a security alarm. Trap me inside.
So when the alarm went off, you just had to stay put? Was that the...
Yeah, if they would have a lockdown, they'd have certain things that caused the lockdown of the security zone, then you'd have to wait until they cleared it.
So what about, what kind of procedures did they add to the security over the years that What more were you doing?
Well, there were physical security changes where they added layers of protection in terms of fences and gates and physical barriers to deal with potential threats. And then they added electronic security to couple with that. And then they added personal security where you had more identification features. They might use a hand scan device to verify it's you to get into certain areas. In addition to administrative features like combination locks on things and procedures where it took more than one person to verify access to an area, that sort of thing.
And you said electronic security as well? What was that?
Like sensors and the like, where they would be monitoring an area continuously, or there'd be cameras or whatever, just electronic surveillance methodologies.
And the hand scan, it was like you put your
handprint down. Yeah, it would verify it was you. You'd have a electronic badge that would identify you just like your credit cards do. Right. And then you put your hand scan and it would confirm that the match to your work.
That was for especially sensitive?
Well, that was for the major production areas. That became for access control. So there were layers of security added. Each time they dealt with insecurity, and you'll talk to some of those people that'll know more about than I would, but there'd be a vulnerability analysis on a threat. I mean, they did them worldwide, and they'd decide whether or not it applied to our system and then either upgrade or not. So it evolved as threats changed in the world.
So were there any specific measures that you knew were responses to specific threats? That
No, I wasn't privy to those.
That's interesting. Did they ever do like the eyeball scans?
Not in areas I went into. I've heard of those, but none that I ever had to access.
It's very action movie. So any other processes, security, sort of interesting, unique aspects of the buildings that? Well,
I think one of the things accounting for the material was always important. Different from security, material control and accountability was a major process because we had to really identify where it was at all times and keep track of it rather rigorously. And, inventories were frequent, but on a day-to-day basis, you track that material throughout the whole site to keep so you didn't lose it. Any loss of material would cause a lockdown or a shutdown and the like, and then we had to re-inventory. So you kept very careful count of the material where it was. So we had a lot of procedures and processes, and we were personally responsible if we had material in use to make sure we had accountability of that material. That was kind of interesting to be personally responsible for a pretty valuable material.
So how did you track it? Was it a lot of signing it out, or was it?
Yeah, you had two-person verifications. You had weighing systems, the chemical analysis systems, scanning systems were used. You can detect radioactivity, and so you had scanners and the like to determine where material was and when it was moved, and a lot of bookkeeping.
So it was generally when it was moved from place to place that it
right.
was that
you'd have to transfer it to people by signature, between people, that kind of thing. So that was a pretty interesting process.
Yeah. A lot of paperwork, huh?
Yeah, and a lot of complex requirements. I mean, to keep up with in addition to regular work. So that was interesting.
Was the classification process ever frustrating or?
Well, not really. I became a classifier fairly early in my career out there. The Plutonium metallurgy group had a classifier. And the guy that was the classifier was getting near retirement age when I joined. And he recommended that I become the group's classifier when he retired. So I sort of studied under him for a couple of years and then became the classifier, and I'm still a classifier. I've been since I've been there, basically. So that was pretty fascinating to me. I didn't have any problem with it at all because I got to learn it all.
Yeah.
It's pretty interesting.
So what did it involve to train to be a classifier?
A lot of study and testing, written testing, requalification, every year, or 2 years, every 2 years. A lot of updates as things would change. You'd have to learn new stuff and retest and that sort of thing. So it was a very interesting part of the process. You got to learn a lot more about the ins and outs of a whole bunch of things being a classifier. But there were still areas where, even as a classifier, were restricted. You know, if they had a limited program, only the people that were authorized to that program were involved in it. And so as a classifier, if somebody brought you something from a program you weren't authorized to know about, you'd have to send them away because you didn't know anything about it. That was kind of interesting.
So what were people bringing you? Any sort of piece of
documentation, data, you know, work where they're evaluating or writing a report about something like that. When you work in the metallurgy side, it was mainly reports, technical reports.
And so they would bring it to you, and you would have to decide what
level of classification, right, applied based on the subject matter.
How many levels were there?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I guess about 8.
And so your training was to figure out what, when, and what
right.
level, and
right.
And what were the dangers of overclassifying things?
Well, spending a lot of time and money on managing the information under a very strict system if you overclassified it. Because as you went up in levels, the level of control went up substantially, and so you didn't want to overclassify something to make it ridiculous to find or to deal with or to add to the management problem. That was expensive.
And then I imagine it's even worse consequences if you underclassify. Or
yeah, although when we were in production, the level of classification was pretty well set for. I mean, there was a common threshold. If you really badly blew one, I mean, the worst thing would be to get something classified onto an unclassified system. That's really the breakover point. Mm-hmm. Those are things you read about in the papers all the time. Right. And that would have been. I always found. That would have been hard to do from my perspective at our place. That would have been hard to do unless somebody was just not thinking. You know, so you brief people in that were going to support you on your project if they were coming from another area and weren't used to dealing with your material, your information. You'd make sure they understood that classification was an important thing. And today, as we close, we've had to really watch ourselves because you get more and more access. Mm-hmm. So you're kind of making sure you don't get too much access to too quickly as they downgrade the classification. We're pretty much out of that now, but it's an interesting transition.
What happens if you get too much access too quickly?
Well, if you start to release things too quickly, then you could compromise other information that's still protected. Okay. That's what you have to watch when you're closing the site.
Okay.
Because like this history, for example, if they take the compilation of history, if people are getting detailed, you could start to piece things together from the history that shouldn't have been pieced together. That could happen.
Got it. So someone was telling me a story about, he said that it happened occasionally that someone would produce a piece of work, a document or something, and it would be classified above a level at which they could read it.
I heard about that. I never saw that. That was an old joke that we used to say, that you now can't read the document you created. I never saw that happen, but I expect it could have. I do know that, there were support people sometimes that would do a portion of an analysis and they weren't cleared for it, but they were doing, like a mathematical analysis of something, and they shouldn't have been given the whole information. They were given too much data. Mm-hmm. And so they had to go in and scrub their computer and brief them and,
Scrub their brains?
Yeah, debrief them and the like.
So what happens when you debrief them?
Oh, you just make it clear that they're not to discuss it with anybody. It's pretty straightforward. No
hypnosis, anything like that?
No, not that I ever saw.
Brainwashing, amnesia, that kind of thing. What was it like not to be able to discuss your work with family and friends?
Initially, my wife was frustrated by that. That bothered her. But she figured out pretty quickly that that's just the way it was going to be. And so it became a non-issue pretty quickly. And the people around this area were fairly used to Rocky Flats people not talking about their work. Because I came here, in '83, the plant had been around a long, long time. And so most people were fairly used to meeting somebody from Rocky Flats and what do you do? Well, I can't tell you, or I can only tell you a little bit. They were used to it.
By the time you got there, it had already loosened up a little bit, right, in terms of...
Well, I don't know. I don't know what that means. I wouldn't have called it, I wouldn't consider what we did information-wise very loose while we were still in production. I suspect there were, at the outset, just like the whole Manhattan Project, there were cover stories created. We didn't have a cover story any longer. Everybody knew it was a nuclear weapons plant by the time I got there. I suspect when they first started, they probably didn't know that.
Yeah, I think that's the case. And I remember, I'm not sure if this was the case when you were there, people saying that you couldn't say the word plutonium, or that you couldn't say that you worked with plutonium.
No, that wasn't the case when I was there.
I think that was earlier on.
There were some things that you couldn't talk about in terms of certain things, but that wasn't one of them.
Can you say what they are now?
No, they're still protected.
Stuff like dimensions and stuff like that.
Well, or processes.
Okay.
That are still not known, and they probably won't be.
Ever.
Yeah, not in a linked context. There may be processes that are in the literature somewhere else, but they're not linked to what we did at Rocky Flats. It's linkage quite often that you control.
Do you ever just want to tell somebody?
No. No, in fact, I go to church in Broomfield, and we got a new priest, an Episcopalian. And he was real curious about what I did, and I was telling him about it. And he started asking about what I did before, and he kind of asked some questions, and finally I just said, this conversation's over. And he kind of perked up. I said, I'm just not going to tell you anymore. Scared him to death. He's never forgotten that.
So he was asking some probing questions?
Well, yeah, he was interested. He's an educated man, and he's curious. He's a PhD, and he was asking a lot of questions, and I said, no, that's as far as we're going. It's just easier than trying to finesse your way through it.
Yeah.
There's no point. It's of no value to him to know.
Right. Interesting. Okay, well, we're at 58 minutes, so why don't I stop right now before we get into other things and change the tape.
Okay.
Number 2 with Art Geis for the Rocky Flats Cold War Museum Oral History Project. It's still March 21st, 2005, and I'm Hannah Nordhaus, and we're still at Art's house in Arvada. So let's see, we are getting there. I guess I wonder if you could tell me a little bit about the work environment at the plant. We talked a little bit about the buildings, but maybe more sort of union and non-union stuff.
Yeah, Steelworkers Union. I'd worked in unionized plants before I came to Rocky Flats, so I was fairly familiar with the union working environment. In fact, Steelworkers was one of the unions that I had experience with in previous manufacturing locations. And the Plutonium metallurgy group where I started, in fact, had 5 union officers in the group. It's a group of very senior people. The metallurgy groups had experimental operators, which were one of the more highly talented and therefore highly prized job classifications in the union. So they were experienced people. They made good money, but they were also, so they had a lot of longevity, a lot of experience in senior people, and quite a few of them were officers in our group. So it was an interesting place to enter the plant with all that horsepower from the union side. And I think it was probably pretty good for me because it gave me a really quick perspective of what their issues were. Struggle, probably my observation was that the union had a struggle about the time of the 80s when I came in, with newer workforce and older workforce. And I had seen it in previous jobs where the as the newer workforce came into the union, they had a very different idea than the older workforce in terms of company loyalty, in terms of their expectations of a union, in terms of their expectations of benefits and salary. It was quite a struggle. I mean, I've seen it more than one place. And it was very similar at Rocky Flats, I thought, where the longer term union employees sort of grew up at the place, had a certain a love for the place and a certain loyalty, lots of family, and the newer guys were pushing on things. There was controversy and struggle going on amidst all this turmoil. But during production, everybody was pretty united around getting the job done. And I mean, we had our days, but I never really had an issue in dealing straight up with people. Our union was not out to submarine the mission because they were dedicated to the mission we had. I mean, they all had clearances like we did, and they were ready to get the job done because we were a key part of the Cold War. And I didn't see people that didn't believe that, frankly. So it was a pretty dedicated workforce in that regard. And so you had to be straight with them. You couldn't blow smoke because they were pretty smart. And I always found that if you were straightforward, then you got treated the same way. So, we went through some turmoil, there's no question about it. I wasn't in labor relations, but as a manager of a group with experienced people, we had to deal with issues straight up. And I guess one of my lessons from that is that if you had a concern filed by somebody and you didn't take care of it, then shame on you, and you probably belonged in a arbitration hearing. If you took care of it and did your job, then you never got there.
So you mentioned this change, this generational change in the union, and you said that the newer generation had different expectations. What were those different expectations? Well,
I think that there was a lot more interest in benefits and sort of looking out for number one, as opposed to initially being a part of the overall core of the site mission, which is normal for new people. I mean, when you come in and you're new, you can't possibly be where they are. And so as a union member, there's a lot of expectation about, I expect to be taken care of in this way. The older members quite often had fought battles to get what we'd gotten already and major strides, and they, you could see a new guy coming in saying, well, you didn't get enough. Well, wait a minute, let me tell you how hard I've worked. And so I don't think it's uncommon from being a new non-union person who comes in and says, well, why aren't you guys doing it this way? Well, let me tell you how far we've come. And so I don't think it was necessarily just particularly a union. I mentioned it only because I saw it every plant I worked at, where the newer union people were always pressing the older people for more sooner, faster, faster, faster. And if you look at today's culture, the computer world, instant gratification, nobody wants to wait on anything. And so that's kind of part of the context, I guess, is the way I'd put it.
And the other thing that you had said, during production there was this real sense of everybody's working towards the same thing, and so there wasn't conflict in that respect. Did that change after production?
Well, when the plant got shut down, it got tense. I mean, not a lot of work going on, all this new oversight. And if you think about a workforce, particularly hourly people who have spent the better part of their lives producing product in hazardous materials. But by the way, I think it was a safer place to work than any other manufacturing plant I worked in, by the way. I know there's some issues about that. But so we're doing something here for the good of the nation, and then these guys come in from Washington and wherever and say, well, you're not safe enough. Well, wait a minute, we've got a good safety record. What do you mean? We put out quality product. It's important for the nation. Why are you shutting us down? So there was a lot of pressure from not just the union people, but from the whole workforce about, are you talking about me? Do you think I'm not up to snuff? There was a lot of personal sense to it, and that created a lot of tension. It really did. That created a lot of tension. It did both things. It pulled us together, and it also drove wedges. It did both things. I think it's all human nature. The union management thing to me is an artifact of human nature, frankly. That's what I observe over time.
So the in terms of the different contractors and labor relations and just general morale, environment, what was your observation?
I came to work, Rockwell was running the place. And I'd heard that Dow was much better, but then I heard Dow was much worse, so it depends on who you talk to. Rockwell, manufacturing, aerospace, pretty traditional in that regard. And relationships were strained with management and the union. There was a strike during that period of time where there were some contentious issues. It wasn't a warm and loving relationship. There were accommodations, and in the end, it was all about the strategic mission of the nation anyway. But there was a lot of strain in that relationship. And I don't know the genesis. Rockwell took over before I got there, so I don't know all the ins and outs of why, but I would say during the Rockwell period it was a pretty strained relationship. EG&G came in after the place had been shut down. I mean, you're walking into an entire workforce that's upset. I'm not sure that relationship, it sort of wandered around a bit. There wasn't a lot of positive energy during that time. It was pretty strained. Kaiser-Hill, to their credit, when they came in, made a substantial effort to improve that. A lot of things changed. It's hard to pick one thing, but a lot of things changed. But people will look back on this project and wonder how in the world this union and this company, because I think it's one of the keys to the success of the closure project, made the relationship work and made it a success. I mean, there really is a strong underpinning to the success of this closure contract is the union management change, commitment to each other to close the place. Changed leadership, of course, in both. A realization that this was the deal. You know, we weren't going to restart, sort of an acceptance of that, and then an agreement to lock hands together and let's go get the job done and figure out how to make it a win-win. That's a pretty remarkable story, probably just by itself.
Yeah, I mean, I would think it'd be difficult for for the union, for the hourly workers, to really embrace this company that's going to put them out of work ultimately.
But they did. You know, and you'd have to. I'm clearly not representing them. I mean, I've never been in the union, but I mean, I know a lot of them, and they're just good people, and they were good people before. You know, so. That figured out that this is the hand we're dealt. And I'd rather do this than have some schmuck that doesn't know what he's doing do it. You know, a lot of pride. A lot of pride. You know, I know the hazards, I know the work. Nobody else does. Well, who better to do it? My family lives here too. I don't want the place closed bad.
Yeah.
So.
So since you started talking about safety, why don't we go there next? I guess obviously you think it was a safe place to work.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, you know, if you look at the safety statistics over the years, I mean, now they're remarkable. But the plant was, because of the controlled nature of the work, a lot less dangerous to work in than any other manufacturing plant I'd ever worked in. A lot less injuries. Serious, you know, I worked in places where there were a lot of serious injuries from equipment, and this place, because of the nature of the equipment's enclosed or better managed, or you're dealing with hazardous materials, we were a lot more careful. And our equipment was a lot better built, and our people were better trained, and it was a pretty darn safe place to work. And we managed the dangerous parts, you know, the potential inhalations. Now, sure, people had exposures and inhalations, but overall, from my experience, it was as safe a place as I've ever worked. My brother works in the petrochemical business, and it's a lot more dangerous to work there than it is to work at Rocky Flats. Always has been.
So why does Rocky Flats have such a bad rap?
Oh, because it makes headlines. I have a pretty jaded view of all that. The materials are toxic. There's no question. The materials were developed and not handled initially in the way that we handle them today because we didn't know as much. So people were harmed over time, just like asbestos, just like any other modern material, just like the coal mine. You can go in any industry, and until you knew the dangers, people got hurt, people got sick. Mm-hmm. This business is no different than that, and I think it's important that the government recognize their responsibility in that regard. I think we all agree with that have worked in a business that, okay, we didn't know everything. This is not about who's right and who's wrong. This is about who committed their lives to work for this product and took the risks, and some of them are taking the hits. And having worked side by side with people, some sick, some not, it's not just about exposures. It's more complex. Mm-hmm. It really is. That's pretty well proven, I think, scientifically. But let's not be stupid about it. If they got sick, let's take care of them, right? I think that's only important. So it's a hazardous place to work. But is it as hazardous as it's played up to be? Was 771 ever really the most dangerous building in America? No, that was a headline.
Was it the most radioactive building in America?
No. Not in my experience, no.
Well,
there are other sites that have much worse radioactive conditions than Rocky Flats ever had. Mm-hmm. So much worse.
Why was 771? Just because people knew about it?
Well, somebody probably coined the phrase, A report was written, and somebody coined the phrase.
Well, what other facility? Did they have the? Because that was because of the fire, or why? No, why was 771 considered the most radioactive building?
Well, certainly its age, its processing history had the most varied processes, mm-hmm. So it had the most potential material in holdup. There's no question about that the radioactive composition of the facility was hazardous, but that title was just press.
Meaningless.
It's. I don't know. I suppose it serves somebody to get money. I don't know. I'm not sure. I'm not a good one to ask about the whys and wherefores of things like that, because I have pretty strong opinions that those are just, there's an agenda somewhere that caused that to be stated. Somebody else had an agenda that served their purposes.
So, when you first arrived at Rocky Flats, what was your perception of the safety there, and has that changed over time as you got to be more comfortable with the process?
Well, I wasn't. In fact, one of the questions they asked you when you came in is, "You're afraid of radiation?" That's one of the things they asked you. Huh. I said, "No," because some people are, and that's okay. But they asked you that, and if you were, I suspect maybe they thought twice about hiring you. More than likely, because why would you hire somebody that's scared to death to come to work there? But I wasn't afraid of it at all. I was more into the process development issues and manufacturing side. And as my perception of the safety changed, certainly we have removed all the hazard pretty much now. Mm-hmm. But the industrial safety is a huge safety impact. Large equipment, and that's takes careful management. Mm-hmm. The radioactive and toxic and chemical hazards are more insidious. You can't always see them, but if you're trained to deal with them and you pay attention to what you're doing, then you can manage that. Our approach to safety has evolved primarily driven by external regulation. Did it improve things? I'm sure it did. I mean, the statistics would say it did, but we also completely shut down. If we'd have stayed in the same mission, it would have been a more interesting comparison to make, I suspect, to see. Because that's not, there's no way to forecast, in my view, if we would have stayed in an operating facility under the new requirements, how we would have measured up. I don't think I could tell.
Were those new requirements aimed, they were aimed at more long-term exposure than short-term exposure, weren't they? Or
well, they were aimed at disciplined operations. When the sort of some factually based opinion, Atomic Energy Commission was formed, Manhattan Project, nobody really knew. I mean, there was a lot of things done in the early days that you wouldn't do today because you know better. But the system relied on people with knowledge. It's called an expert-based system. Rocky Flats and the rest of the DOE weapons complex operated on that kind of system. What the late 80s brought to bear was a more procedurally controlled system, modeling more after the Nuclear Navy's program or the Commercial Nuclear Reactor program after 3 Mile Island, where they took a different approach, which is to say, we'll establish the engineering basis, we'll establish the procedure basis, we'll train people to procedures, we'll have more consistent, reliable performance regardless of the human. Okay?
Your expert base was, these people know what they're doing.
Right, very much human dependent. Okay, very much human dependent. Because people had to make decisions, judgment, they had to know what they were doing, had to understand the hazards. There weren't a lot of procedures to train new people too. Remember I said new people were trained one-on-one by an expert. So the change really was a change in approach to how you manage high hazard businesses that had been implemented in those 2 other industries and not in the DOE.
And do you think that, and this is where you're saying the jury's out as to whether it's actually better?
Well, there's no way for me to forecast. I mean, I've not worked in an operating facility in the DOE under these standards. I don't know how that's going to change. I just don't have any information on it.
Do they do both now, or have you lost the sort of transmission of human knowledge?
Well, that was one of the risks when you closed it. If you lost all the expertise, could you safely close it? We retained it and used it. Process knowledge, you call it. They interviewed a lot of retirees to determine about the hazards at the site as they developed closure plans. So we retained the expert-based knowledge for process, but we operate more to procedures under the current DOE system. Certainly, operating procedures is a part of why we're safe today. There's no question about it, because we brought in new workforce to tear the place down, and so you couldn't have had the same expertise. It was impossible. So not having the procedures would have been short-sighted. But I don't know about operating, because we didn't operate. We didn't continue to operate, so it's really hard to tell.
Were you ever exposed to anything?
Sure.
And did you have to do the whole shower?
Yeah, I take a shower once or twice.
How was that?
It was fine. It cleaned off. I had to come home and not in my regular clothes a few times. My wife kind of wondered, what are you wearing that for?
Did that freak her out when you told her? Or?
A little bit, yeah. A little bit.
And what were did you realize that you've been exposed, or you just sort of set off an alarm?
No, I mean, when there was an event or a spill or something, you knew you were likely. A couple times I was surprised, but not more than a couple times.
Did you ever ingest anything?
I don't have a lung burden or a body burden based on the results. I don't have one. So I'm lucky in that regard.
Do you think that the folks whose health has suffered have been well taken care of?
Well, the ones I know, which is a limited group, I think so. The ones I know.
But you hear stories, I guess.
Well, you see stuff in the paper. There was one in this last weekend's paper. And I have a person who works for me now whose husband's going through that I didn't really know. I mean, I knew him at work after, later in his career, but he's got a severe cancer, and they're they're struggling through all this issues about accountability right now. So it's a pretty tough environment. So I've learned a lot from her about a family who's living through it and the perspective. We were just talking about it this week about, you know, if you were king for a day, what would you do different, or what could you do, and that sort of thing, because it's still difficult when I worked with people who were involved in the same processes, and one gets sick and the other one doesn't. And so you just know there's got to be something in the human that relates to how this occurs. And, you know, could you have prevented that? I don't know. You know, we didn't know enough about DNA to even predict it. But there was a lot of studies going on, a lot of medical testing. One of my groups, in fact, supported the medical community in developing tests for sensitivity to the toxic metals, the berylliums, the titaniums, the vanadiums, and all that. I had a coatings group. We developed test beds for them to do their experimental work on, which was really interesting to get involved in. So I have a lot of empathy for those folks. I mean, it's tough. There's no way to know, you know, how it fell. I was fortunate, I guess.
So you said your colleague whose husband, you said they're dealing with issues of accountability, meaning
well, they're involved in all this falderall across the nation about who's going to get compensated, how much they're going to get compensated, how they're going to prove whether or not they should be compensated. I mean, all this stuff that's going on that you read about in the press with Congress, and now what the Department of Energy was, the Department of Labor, it's been turned over to the Department of Labor to deal with this, and the local congressmen and senators are wanting a Rocky Flat specific bill passed to make sure it's taken care of. And so there's a lot going on, and of course these families that are living it every day, you know, there's no way I can I can empathize with them, but I can't know what they're going through. It's got to be just brutal. And
I guess what they're having to deal with in part is trying to make some link between their illness and their work at Rocky Flats. Yeah, and trying to, you know, if there's a study that says this type of cancer or this type of cancer, and you know, that's just maddening. The bureaucracy's got to be maddening when you're sick. Yeah. Because you know, I know some people who've gotten sick and it was clear identified, and you know, they've been sick, but they felt like they were taken care of. But now I'm meeting people who are in this swarf of people where this process is not working effectively. So, and it's mainly the borreliosis people who. No, that's a one that clearly is, certain people are sensitized and certain people aren't. Clearly, that one is. But it's certainly caused by their work with beryllium as well. Well, I mean, beryllium, yeah. If you're sensitive to it, it doesn't matter where you worked. I mean, you're gonna, right. If you were exposed to it, you're gonna get it. I mean, it's really nasty. But I've worked in beryllium in 3 different jobs, not just at Rocky Flats. So this isn't the only place that you work with beryllium. The guys that I know worked at Rocky Flats their whole lives, so that's probably where they got exposed. Right. But you know, there's beryllium in brake linings and stuff on cars. So, I mean, if they machined brake linings working in their home, they could have been exposed too. So, but all that's immaterial when somebody's sick, in my view. You're saying there are the people where where they are taken care of, and then the people where it's sort of in that gray area. And who are the people who are taken care of? Well, I just know a couple of people who got sick, had a pretty clear identified situation, were involved in a process that, you know, for getting medical benefits and the like, were in a testing program and were dealt with pretty quickly. And then there's this whole group of people that are involved in this, what I would call a morass of the system sluggishly getting monies out of all these bills and stuff, and it's just, that's kind of tough to see. Yeah. Seems to take too long. Yep. So you mentioned briefly your experience the 1880, the FBI raid, but we didn't really go into detail, so I'm wondering if you could tell me your memories of that. Well, I remember the sort of the announcement over the PA system that a synopsis of what was going on, and that the activities were curtailed, and you'd see people around, and you know, if you're not involved, don't get involved.
You know, because we were all pretty security conscious about people coming in, and so they were cautioning us not to get infringe upon anything, and they would be escorted and managed and the like. And then they began to come into offices and start looking through files and boxing up files of various kinds of things and taking them out of there. And then you start reading the articles about what was going on. I remember one thing fairly vividly, because I worked in Building 771 at the time, and there was this allegation that we were operating the incinerator, and it hadn't operated for years. And so I began to think, you know, this is a put-up job.
So did you think that the raid was warranted in any way?
No. No.
Any good come out of it?
Probably. I expect so. I'm good. Good always comes out of. If people put their minds to solving a problem, then good comes out of everything.
So when production stopped, what was your reaction when it was announced?
Well, I frankly did expect that we would restart rather quickly because of our mission. Mm-hmm. I didn't expect us to be shut down forever. You know, we were assembled onto teams of people that were responsible for certain restart activities. They brought in some people from the outside to help us plan the work and get organized about assembling information, proving that we were in a safe configuration to work and getting back in business. So we all worked really hard on putting together that data and putting together proof files of information and presenting our case, and because we thought we'd be back in business in 6 weeks.
And when it was announced that it was over for good, what was your reaction?
Well, there might be an interesting data point here. I was actually at the meeting where our executive vice president came back from Washington, D.C. with a full realization that we weren't going to restart in 6 weeks. He had met with the people in Washington from the regulatory oversight people and the Department of Energy, and they had determined that they were going to require that we use the operational readiness review process to restart, which is a very rigorous, time-consuming, difficult process. Mm-hmm. And he knew full well what it meant, and he was stunned, I would call it, because he knew we were in for a very long process. He was an EG&G senior vice president, had experience with the terminology of the nuclear facility business, and knew that we were in for the long pull and it was going to be a real struggle then. And I was at that meeting, and it was kind of like discovering our whole lives are going to change now. It's not going to just be get back up in business. It was going to be a major effort. And so then when we went through the effort, and it was quite a proud day when the Secretary of Energy handed me that plaque and we restarted our laboratory. And then literally the same month, I think February '92, I think when the Berlin Wall came down, I think. I may be off on my history, but they're pretty close to the same time. And we didn't have any inkling at the time that would, even though that we would stop our mission. And again, I don't really remember now when they said we weren't going to have a mission. That's all gotten lost in the fuzz, but I was surprised. I really was surprised. I did not think our government would take the position of not maintaining and refurbishing the nuclear stockpile as a deterrent. I thought it was premature for that decision, but of course I didn't have their information base. Mm-hmm. Thought it was a gamble for the nation to be there. And our plant had such a key role in a couple of key places that I was a little concerned that we would be able to maintain things successfully without our plant. So I was surprised.
You still think it's premature? It was premature? It is?
Well, on a technical standpoint, we'd have been a lot smarter to keep it for a little while longer. our transition planning was pretty poor nationally to transfer our technology. I mean, just to stop it and then transfer the technology, I would have done it in a little more orderly fashion. Wouldn't have, sort of closed all the windows and doors, bolted the doors shut, and then decided to transfer the technology. That to me was, I wouldn't have done it that way. But.
Now, do you think if the Berlin Wall hadn't fallen and the Soviet Union hadn't dissolved, but there were still this sort of environmental issues and the community opposition, do you think that the plant would have restarted?
Yep.
And now you came to Rocky Flats sort of after the height of the protests. Or were they still going on while you were
probably. I mean, they circled the plant while I was working there on Nagasaki Day. What did I think about it?
Yeah.
I don't know. I guess I didn't really, I didn't think much about it, frankly. I really didn't. I mean, that's the great thing about our country, I suppose, is what I thought about it. But I knew what we were doing was important, and I knew what we were doing well. So I didn't really, outside of my sphere of influence.
Did you meet any protesters or have any contact with them?
Well, other than finding out that people, like at my church or whatever, were protesters, usually found out when they found out you work at Rocky Flats, you found out where they stood pretty quick.
That make for some spirited discussion.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. And a lot of the interesting wives' tales about how I lived downwind and my trees all died one summer and I know it was Rocky Flats. Well, no, it probably wasn't. But you can think that if you want. No point in arguing somebody that might have got their mind made up.
I guess the other sort of social change that may have happened before you got there was women on the production lines.
Yeah,
and
that happened before I got there.
Minorities. Did you see any of that transition happening, or had it already happened when you got there?
It pretty much happened before I got there. Yeah. Although there were still quite a few younger people. In '83 when I came there, we were building up our payroll. That was a big build year. It went from one size plant to another size plant during the early '80s to support some production commitments. Mm-hmm. And so there was a lot of influx of younger people of genders and races of all kinds. And so I was probably in the middle of some of that occurring, mm-hmm. Along with a lot of folks that same year.
Did you get a sense that the atmosphere of the plant changed dramatically? My frame of reference was, again, other plants I'd worked at. And I didn't see any difference between this plant and those plants. Manufacturing plants tend to have a certain swagger about them, and people that are working at them are usually pretty self-assured of what they're doing, and so there's an interesting byplay. I remember one specific instance. There was in 771 building, the layout of the building was such that there was a hallway here, a center hallway, and another hallway, and the locker rooms were between this hallway and the center hallway. And if there was an issue with restrictions due to some contamination on one hallway, then you might have to go through the locker room to get to the other hallway to get back to your work area. Well, I'll never forget this one day. There was this crew of people who were coming in from outside the building to support a maintenance job. And this one gal was on this work crew, and they had to go through the men's locker room to get, that's the way they went. They chose to go. She just marched right through the men's locker room. And she was easily 6 foot tall, big gal, and guys were going crazy, And one guy who was, I remember he was fairly strict religiously. He came out to the building manager and just raising holy heck about this gal coming through the locker room.
And so the building manager calls her out to his office, and she says, I've seen worse, it was really kind of funny. So a lot of that went on, a lot of that went on. There were probably unhealthy things that went on too. I mean, we all heard rumors or saw or whatever. There always were between the different genders and different, but I had seen that in every plant I'd ever worked.
So what sort of rumors did you hear?
Well, there'd be love nests where somebody was married and somebody wasn't married, and just patent place.
Stuff that didn't happen as much when there were no women back there.
Couldn't have, yeah. But it was a big place. I mean, a plant was 5,000 people in it, just like a little city, right? So it's going to be everything you get in a little city. And it was no different than any other plant I'd ever worked in from that perspective. But it's kind of funny to see how people react.
Yeah. So I guess just a few wrap-up questions and then we're done. How did you feel about working in a plant that produced a key part of nuclear weapons?
I was really proud to work there. Still am. Still am. I think we were a big part of that change in the world situation because they worked.
And are you, we discussed this a little bit before, are you equally as proud
to
take it?
This cleanup is really cool. I tell people all throughout my, outside the plant, I'm really looking forward to walking out there on that cleaned up site. In fact, the thing I like now that's interesting is that, we've made such a good job of working with the local initiative groups and the municipalities that understand the cleanup standards. And when this guy who was the grand jury foreman, who's now a congressman, starts raising stink, well, a local activist who's always been on us says, I'm taking my children out there, I don't know about you. That really makes me proud. Because that person now understands that, people out there are just as dedicated as anybody else about doing the job right. Not going to hide anything, going to get it done. It's going to be a wildlife preserve, and that's going to be really cool.
What sounds like there's still some tussling over how clean is clean enough.
Yep.
There's just some.
There will never be people that are satisfied unless you fenced it off.
What about a couple of people I've talked to who worked at the plant were concerned about the fact that they're not going down low enough.
Well, the cleanup standards are down to fairly low levels at fairly significant depths. I mean, there's an established protocol above which we have to pull out all buried stuff. We have to sample down to a certain cleanup level throughout the whole. I mean, I'm not an expert in that field at all, but I work next to a guy who's one of the key people on that, and I just know from how he operates and how his peers operate that they are going to find everything that's findable, and it's going to get dealt with. And they're doing a good job of using all that process knowledge and all those interviews, pulling the string on issues, continuing to resample. And we have to prove that we met the cleanup standards, and they're pretty strict. Now they're not there's cleanup standards for what we agreed to. Not everybody's happy with what we agreed to. There are people that worked out there before that if they have an issue about an area, that they should be telling somebody. Because these guys were involved in interviewing like this, interviewing people who were, where was the spill? What happened? What were you working with? And they spent hours and hours and hours talking to those folks. And so if somebody knows something and hasn't said something, then shame on them. Because we worked really hard to try to deal with all that.
Okay. So what were the best things about working at Rocky Flats?
The people. People were the best by far. It's the hardest thing to leave is those folks. A lot of good folks. What was the worst? I suppose being misconstrued by people here that became your friends and them thinking bad about you because of what they read. That was the worst. That was the hardest part. Being mistrusted. That was difficult.
Okay, well, anything I missed?
Oh, I don't know, probably. We probably,
Any stories?
you'll
that
probably get back and somebody will say, what'd you ask him all? That didn't help us at all.
Sure, it'll be helpful. And so you said you've already donated the resumption plaque, it sounds
Yep.
like? And,
Yep. I don't really have any other trinkets. None of mine were keepable.
Yeah. All right, well, if that's it, then thank you very much for
You're welcome.
participating. Great interview.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Thanks for your time.